Captain Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the research vessel Endeavour and watched the ancient ruins below through the main viewscreen. The dead planet had no name in human records, just a catalog number that meant nothing to anyone except the scientists who studied such things. She had been captain of this ship for 3 years now, and every mission felt like opening a door to the past. The Endeavour was not built for war or conquest. It carried mining equipment, archaeological tools, and laboratories filled with people who cared more about old stones than space battles. 200 souls called this ship home, from the youngest graduate student to Professor Martinez, who had studied alien cultures for 40 years. They were explorers, not soldiers. "Captain, we're getting some interesting readings from the northern continent," said Dr. Kim from her science station. "The structures there are definitely artificial, but the composition is unlike anything we've seen before." Sarah nodded and moved closer to examine the data. The ruins spread across several hundred square kilometers, their geometric patterns clearly the work of an intelligent species that had died out long before humans ever looked at the stars. "How long do you estimate for a full survey?" "At least 2 weeks if we want to do it properly," Dr. Kim replied. "The complexity of the site suggests a highly advanced civilization. We might learn something significant about this region of space. That was why they were here, so far from Earth that the sun was just another star among billions." The Endeavour moved through space, carrying humanity's curiosity to dead worlds and empty systems, trying to understand who had lived here before and what had happened to them. It was peaceful work, the kind that made Sarah proud to wear her captain's uniform. She had no way of knowing that they had crossed an invisible line, drawn by an empire that spanned 10,000 star systems. The star charts in Earth's databases were centuries old, compiled from probe data and long-range observations. They could not account for the political realities of a galaxy filled with thinking beings. To Captain Shun and her crew, this was empty. Space around a dead world. To the Zephyrian Empire, this was sacred territory that no alien species was permitted to enter. The Zephyrians had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 2,000 years. Their ships were powered by technology that humanity was still trying to understand. Their weapons could crack planets, and their military doctrine had never failed them in all the centuries since they first reached for the stars. They were not evil, merely absolute in their belief that order must be maintained and that unauthorized presence in their space was an act of war. Admiral Kethvar received the alert in his command chamber aboard the dreadnought Eternal Judgment. A junior officer approached his platform with the measured steps that protocol demanded and delivered his report in the flat tone that military efficiency required. "Admiral, our border sensors have detected an unauthorized vessel in the Kepler 779 system. The ship appears to be conducting surface operations on the 4th planet." Kethvar studied the data with the same methodical attention he had given to 1,000 similar reports over his 30-year career. The vessel was small, clearly, not designed for military purposes, and showed technological signatures that matched no known species in their databases. This could mean only one thing. "A new species," he said, more to himself than to the officer. "How long since first detection?" 18 hours, Admiral. The vessel has deployed smaller craft to the planet's surface and appears to be conducting some form of systematic survey. The Admiral considered this information with the careful deliberation that had made him one of the Empire's most trusted commanders. A new species making unauthorized contact with Imperial territory presented both an opportunity and a threat. The opportunity was to demonstrate Imperial power to another race that would eventually need to understand their place in the galactic order. The threat was allowing any precedent of unauthorized entry to stand unchallenged. "Prepare a cleansing." "Force," Kethvar ordered. "Standard doctrine for pest extermination. 12 ships should be sufficient." The officer recorded the command and transmitted it to the fleet coordinators. Within hours, 12 Zephyrian warships broke formation from the Border Patrol and set course for the Kepler system. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a Chul city, and together they represented more military might than most species could imagine. Back on the Endeavor, Dr. Martinez climbed out of the shuttle after spending 14 hours examining the ruins firsthand. His excitement was visible to everyone on the landing bay as he practically bounced toward the lift that would take him to the laboratories. "Captain, you need to see what we found down there," he called out as Sarah approached. "These aren't just ruins. They're a library, a massive archive of information stored in crystalline matrices. If we can decode even a fraction of it, we might learn about dozens of species that lived in this region." Surah felt the familiar thrill that came with significant discovery. This was why the Endeavor traveled so far from home, why Earth invested in ships like this one, and crews willing to spend years in deep space. Every dead world might hold answers to questions humanity was still learning to ask. "How long will you need to make a preliminary assessment?" she asked. "Give me 3 days. With the main computer array, and I should be able to determine if the data is recoverable," Martinez replied. "If it is, we're looking at months of work, but it could revolutionize our understanding of this entire region of space." Sarah made her decision the way she always did, by weighing the scientific value against the practical risks. They were far from any known shipping lanes. The system showed no signs of current habitation, and Earth would want them to investigate anything this potentially significant. "You have your 3 days, Professor, Dr. Kim. Extend our survey timeline accordingly." None of them knew that the Zephyrian cleansing force was already halfway to their position. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was monitoring the sensor array when the first contact alert began sounding throughout the ship. He stared at his displays for several seconds, trying to process what he was seeing before reaching for the ship-wide communication system. "Captain to the bridge immediately. We have unknown contacts approaching at high velocity." Sarah arrived within minutes and took her position in the command chair as her officers provided rapid updates on the situation. 12 large vessels had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and were moving toward their position with obvious hostile intent. "Any response to our standard greeting transmissions?" Sarah asked. "Negative, Captain. We've tried on all standard frequencies and several emergency channels. They're not responding to any communication attempts." Sarah studied the tactical display and felt a cold understanding settle in her stomach. These were not exploration vessels or merchant ships. The energy signatures and formation patterns could only mean one thing. "Battle stations," she ordered. "All civilian personnel to emergency shelters. Prepare for possible combat." The Endeavor had never been designed to fight a war. Its shields were meant to deflect cosmic radiation and small debris, not military-grade weapons. Its only offensive capability came from mining lasers designed to cut through asteroid rock, not enemy armor. But Captain Sarah Chun had not spent 15 years in space to surrender without trying to protect her crew. "Open a channel on all frequencies," she commanded. "This is Captain Sarah Chun of the Earth vessel Endeavor. We are a peaceful research mission with no hostile intent. We are prepared to withdraw from this system immediately if our presence is unwelcome." The response came in the form of plasma bolts that struck their forward shields with devastating force. The bridge lights flickered, and damage reports began streaming in from every deck. "Return fire with everything we have," Sarah ordered. "Engineering, I need everything you can give me from the reactor." Helm, evasive maneuvers. The Endeavor's mining lasers were pathetically inadequate against military shields, but the crew had not survived 3 years in deep space by giving up when faced with impossible odds. They redirected power from life support to weapons, overloaded their reactor to dangerous levels, and turned their archaeological survey drones into makeshift missiles. Dr. Martinez abandoned his laboratory and ran to the nearest weapons control station. Professor Kim rerouted the main computer's processing power to target acquisition. Even the graduate students found ways to contribute, manually loading mining charges into the torpedo tubes that had never been designed for combat. The battle lasted 47 minutes. The Endeavour managed to destroy 3 Zephyrian vessels and severely damage 4 others by using tactics that no military academy in the galaxy had ever taught. They rammed one enemy ship with their cargo bay doors open, spilling mining equipment that tore through the alien vessel's hull. They detonated their own shuttlecraft as proximity bombs. They even used their tractor beam to hurl asteroids at their attackers. But there were too many enemies and too few options. The Endeavour's shields finally collapsed under sustained fire, and plasma bolts began tearing through the hull. Captain Sarah Chun used her final moments to activate the emergency beacon that would carry their story back to Earth. This is Captain Chun of the research vessel Endeavour. We have been attacked without provocation by unknown hostile forces, transmitting all tactical data and sensor readings. Tell Earth what happened here. Tell them we tried to talk first. The transmission burst away into hyperspace, just as the Endeavour's reactor went critical, and the ship disappeared in a brief star that lit up the dead planet below. Admiral Kethfer stared at the wreckage field where the alien vessel had made its final stand. 3 of his ships were gone, and 4 more would require extensive repairs. For a pest extermination mission, the casualties were unacceptable. Analysis of the enemy vessel, he requested. Primitive technology, Admiral, but employed with unexpected creativity. They appeared to adapt their civilian equipment for combat purposes in real time. Most unusual for a first contact scenario. Kethvar filed his report to Imperial Command as a routine border enforcement action with minor complications. He did not mention the casualties or the strange desperation with which the aliens had fought. Some things were better left unrecorded, but in the darkness of space, a message was already racing toward a small blue planet, carrying news that would change everything. 6 months after the Endeavour disappeared, the emergency beacon reached Earth's Deep Space Monitoring Station in the Alpha Centauri system. The message traveled through 3 relay points before finally arriving at the United Earth Defense Council headquarters in Geneva, where technician Amanda Foster was working the night shift alone. She almost deleted it as routine survey data until she saw Captain Chun's final words in the transmission log. Amanda had never heard fear in a starship captain's voice before, but Sarah Chun's last message carried something that made her hands shake as she reached for the priority alert button. Within 12 hours, every major government on Earth knew that humanity had made first contact with an alien species. Within 24 hours, they knew that first contact had ended with the complete destruction of a human research vessel and the death of 200 civilians who had been trying to study ancient ruins on a dead planet. Director James Morrison of the United Earth Defense Council had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, though he had always imagined it would involve diplomacy and cultural exchange rather than unprovoked attack. He stood before the emergency session of the Global Security Committee and delivered the news that would change human civilization forever. Ladies and gentlemen, we are no longer alone in the universe, and we are no longer safe, Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Analysis of the Endeavour's final transmission indicates we face an enemy with superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and a military doctrine that treats first contact as an act of war. The committee members asked the obvious questions about peaceful resolution and diplomatic contact, but Morrison had already studied every second of combat data that Captain Chun had managed to transmit. The alien fleet had opened fire without warning, ignored all attempts at communication, and systematically destroyed a defenseless research vessel that posed no possible threat to anyone. There will be no negotiation, Morrison stated flatly. The enemy's response to our peaceful presence was immediate and total violence. We must assume they view our entire species as something to be exterminated. President Hassan of the African Colonial Authority leaned forward in her chair and asked the question that everyone was thinking. What do you recommend we do? Morrison activated the holographic display that showed humanity's current military assets scattered across 47 star systems. It was an impressive sight, representing 3 centuries of expansion and technological development. But he knew it was not enough to face an enemy that could casually deploy 12 warships to destroy a single research vessel. We consolidate. Everything, Morrison announced. Every human being, every ship, every factory, every scientific database, every military asset. We bring it all home, and we prepare for the fight of our species' existence. The global recall began 48 hours later. Every human colony received the same transmission, broadcast simultaneously across all communication networks with the USIN. Highest possible priority. The message was simple and absolute. Come home now, bring everything you can, leave nothing for the enemy. On Kepler Colony, Governor Martinez looked at the recall order and made the hardest decision of his administrative career. 50,000 colonists had spent 2 generations building a civilization on a world that was finally becoming truly habitable. Now they had 6 months to dismantle everything they had created and flee back to Earth. The exodus began immediately. Transport ships that had been designed to carry cargo were hastily converted to passenger service. Industrial equipment was broken down into portable components. Entire cities were systematically dismantled and packed for shipment. Nothing that could be useful was left behind. Dr. Angela Ross had been studying quantum mechanics at the Europa Research Station when the recall order arrived. She had been 3 years into a project that might have revolutionized faster-than-light travel, but now she found herself helping to pack laboratory equipment while security teams prepared to destroy anything that could not be moved. 30 years of research, she muttered to her colleague as they sealed the last container of experimental data. 30 years of progress, and we're abandoning it all to run home like frightened children. Better frightened children than dead heroes, her colleague replied. And Angela knew he was right, even though it felt like defeat. The recall was not just about people and equipment. Earth's intelligence services activated every deep cover operative, every monitoring station, and every information gathering asset they had scattered throughout human space. If humanity was going to face an enemy with superior technology, they needed to know everything possible about that enemy's capabilities and weaknesses. Admiral Patricia Vega commanded the Third Fleet from her flagship, Constellation, when she received orders to return to Earth immediately with all vessels under her command. Her 28 ships represented one of humanity's most powerful military formations. But she had studied the combat data from the Endeavor's final battle and knew that her entire fleet might not be enough to defeat the 12 alien vessels that had destroyed Captain Chan's ship. "Ma'am, the logistics coordinators are asking about our deployment schedule," her aide reported. "They want to know how quickly we can reach Earth." Vega studied the star charts that showed the current position of every human military unit in known space. The recall was bringing together the largest concentration of military power in human history, but she wondered if it would be enough. "Tell them we'll be home in 4 months," she replied, "and tell them to have the shipyards ready. We're going to need every ship they can build." On Earth, the preparation for war began with a speed and intensity that surprised even Director Morrison. The competing nations and corporations that had spent decades arguing about territory and resources suddenly found themselves working together with a unity that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. The Chinese stellar Navy shared their gravitational manipulation research with the European Space Consortium. The American Deep Space Command opened their classified weapons development programs to scientists from every member nation. The African Colonial Authority began mining operations on a scale that would have been environmentally unthinkable just months earlier. Dr. Chun Wu had been working on theoretical weapons, designs for the Chinese military, when he found himself assigned to a joint task force that included his former rivals from 3 different continents. The project was simple in concept and terrifying in scope. Design weapons that could kill an enemy with superior technology. We can't match their energy output or their defensive capabilities, Dr. Chun explained to the international team during their first planning session. But we can be unpredictable. Every engagement the Endeavor fought suggests that our enemy follows rigid tactical doctrines. They expect their opponents to behave in predictable ways. Professor Sarah Kim from the European Consortium nodded thoughtfully. So we don't fight the way they expect us to fight. We make our weakness into our strength. The weapons development teams began working on projects that would have been considered insane under normal circumstances. They designed ships that could function as guided missiles. They created weapons that turned industrial equipment into military assets. They developed tactics that assumed human crews would accept casualties that no rational species would consider acceptable. Meanwhile, the intelligence analysis teams worked around the clock to understand everything they could about the enemy from the limited data that Captain Chun had managed to transmit. The alien ships used energy weapons, traveled faster than anything in the human fleet, and appeared to be organized according to military principles that prioritized overwhelming force over tactical creativity. They fight like they've never lost. A battle, intelligence analyst David Park reported to Morrison during one of their daily briefings. Every tactical decision suggests complete confidence in their technological superiority. They don't adapt their strategies because they've never needed to. Morrison studied the analysis reports and began to understand what humanity's strategy would need to be. They could not win through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but they might be able to win by being something their enemy had never encountered before, an opponent that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. The months passed with desperate intensity as humanity transformed itself from a peaceful spacefaring civilization into something designed for war. The recall brought home nearly 12 million people and thousands of ships of every description. Earth's orbital shipyards worked at maximum capacity to convert civilian vessels into military assets. On the research stations around Jupiter, scientists studied every piece of debris and sensor data from the Endeavor's final battle. They learned that the enemy's weapons had predictable energy signatures, that their ships maneuvered according to specific formation patterns, and that they had not adapted their tactics even when facing unexpected resistance. Dr. Martinez, who had barely escaped from Kepler colony before the transport ships departed, found himself assigned to a project that analyzed alien psychology based on their military behavior. His conclusions were disturbing, but potentially useful. They're not just technologically superior, he reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're psychologically inflexible. They attacked the Endeavor because unauthorized presence in their territory required a military response. They used overwhelming force because their doctrine demands it. They didn't try to communicate because their protocols don't include that option. General Harrison of the American Deep Space Command leaned forward with interest. Are you saying they're predictable? I'm saying they're systematic, Martinez replied. They follow rules, and that means we can exploit those rules if we're willing to break every rule of our own. As the second year of preparation began, humanity had become something it had never been before, a species united by the absolute certainty that they faced extinction if they failed to win the war that was coming. The peaceful researchers and traders who had spread across the galaxy were gone, replaced by billions of people who understood that their survival depended on becoming better at war than an enemy that had ruled the galaxy for 2,000 years. Director Morrison stood in the command center beneath Geneva and watched the status displays that showed humanity's military preparations. In 18 months, they had accomplished what should have taken decades. But he wondered if it would be enough when the enemy finally came to finish what they had started in the Kepler system. The transformation was complete, but the real test was still waiting somewhere among the stars. 2 years after the Endeavor's destruction, the first human scout ships began appearing in Zephyrian space like ghosts that refused to stay buried. They were small vessels, barely larger than shuttles, equipped with experimental stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to conventional sensors. Their mission was simple: watch, learn, and disappear before anyone noticed they had been there. Commander Lisa Park piloted the reconnaissance ship Shadow through the outer regions of the Helix Nebula, where Zephyrian patrol routes created gaps that a careful pilot could exploit. Her ship carried no weapons and minimal life support, but its sensor arrays could record everything within a light-year radius and transmit the data back to Earth through quantum burst communications. Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, her sensor operator whispered, though there was no one else in space to hear them. Single vessel, cruiser class, following standard patrol pattern. Lisa watched the alien ship move through its predetermined route with mechanical precision. After 6 months of observation, she had learned that Zephyrian military operations followed protocols that never varied. Every patrol followed the same path. Every formation maintained identical spacing. Every response to detected anomalies proceeded according to established procedures. Record everything, she ordered. Weapons signatures, shield frequencies, engine emissions. When they find us, we disappear. The Shadow's mission was part of a larger intelligence operation that had been running for 18 months. Dozens of human scout ships moved through Zephyrian territory, gathering information about military installations, fleet movements, and technological capabilities. They avoided direct contact whenever possible, but when detection was inevitable, they activated their experimental junk drives and vanished into hyperspace before the enemy could respond. Admiral Kethvar had been receiving reports of these mysterious contacts for over a year, and each incident made him more concerned about the implications. The unknown ships appeared without warning, gathered intelligence for days or weeks, and then disappeared using technology that his best scientists could not explain or duplicate. Another ghost contact in the Veda sector, his intelligence officer, reported during the morning briefing. The patrol ships detected energy signatures consistent with our previous encounters, but the vessel had vanished by the time they reached the coordinates. Kethvar studied the reports that had been accumulating on his desk for months. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood military strategy. Someone was conducting systematic reconnaissance of Imperial space, gathering the kind of detailed intelligence that could only be used for planning a major military operation. Have we identified the species responsible for these incursions? He asked. Negative, Admiral. The technology signatures are consistent with the vessel we destroyed in the Kepler system 2 years ago, but that seems impossible. We eliminated that species completely. The Admiral stared at the tactical display that showed the locations of every reported ghost contact over the past 18 months. The pattern covered thousands of cubic light years, suggesting an intelligence operation far more sophisticated than anything a primitive species should have been capable of organizing. Prepare a report for Imperial Command, Kethvar ordered. Include all contact data and recommend increased border security. Something is planning to attack us. But Imperial Command had other priorities. The report disappeared into a bureaucracy that had been managing galactic affairs for 2 millennia without facing a serious military threat. A few mysterious contacts on the frontier were hardly worth disrupting the smooth operation of an empire that controlled 10,000 star systems. On Earth, the intelligence gathered by ships like the Shadow was being analyzed by teams of scientists and military strategists who worked around the clock to understand their enemy. Dr. Sarah Kim had been studying Zephyrian military doctrine for 18 months, and her conclusions were both encouraging and terrifying. They're incredibly advanced, but they're also incredibly predictable, she reported to Director Morrison during one of their weekly briefings. Every fleet formation follows identical patterns. Every weapons engagement proceeds according to the same tactical sequence. Every defensive response matches predetermined protocols. Morrison studied the holographic displays that showed months of accumulated intelligence data. The Zephyrian Empire was vast beyond human comprehension, with military resources that dwarfed anything humanity could assemble, but their very success had made them vulnerable in ways they probably didn't understand. They've been winning for so long that they've forgotten how to adapt, Morrison realized. They fight the same way because that way has always worked for them. Exactly, Dr. Kim agreed. And that gives us an opportunity. We can't match their technology or their numbers, but we can be something they've never encountered before. An enemy that doesn't follow any rules they understand. The human military preparation had continued for 2 years with an intensity that transformed every aspect of Earth's civilization. The orbital shipyards around Earth, Luna, and Mars worked at maximum capacity to produce vessels that were part warship and part suicide weapon. The new human fleet was designed around a single tactical principle. Every ship was expendable if its destruction could damage the enemy. Captain Maria Rodriguez commanded the destroyer Defiance, one of 300 vessels in the new Earth Defense Fleet. Her ship carried conventional weapons and shields, but it also carried something no military designer had ever put on a warship before: a manual override that would allow her to detonate the ship's reactor at will, turning the entire vessel into a guided nuclear weapon. It's not about winning individual battles, she explained to her crew during their final training exercise. It's about making sure that every battle costs them more than they're willing to pay. We hurt them until they decide that destroying humanity isn't worth the price. The human strategy was as simple as it was terrifying. They would fight like a disease, spreading through enemy formations and causing damage out of all proportion to their numbers. Every human ship would carry multiple backup systems. Every human pilot would be trained to continue fighting even after their primary weapons failed. And every human commander would be prepared to sacrifice their vessel if it could take enemy ships with them. Colonel James Chun, no relation to the Endeavor's captain, oversaw the training programs that were producing a new generation of human military personnel. His pilots learned to fly ships that were barely controllable. His engineers learned to keep weapons functioning even after catastrophic damage. And his tacticians learned to plan battles where victory was measured by how much damage they could inflict before being destroyed. We're not training soldiers, he told his staff during one of their planning sessions. We're training weapons that happen to look like people. Every human in this fleet needs to understand that they are ammunition in a war that will be won by whoever is willing to pay the highest price. The strategy extended beyond the military. Human civilian infrastructure was being redesigned around the assumption that Earth itself might become a battlefield. The population centers were connected by underground transportation networks. The industrial facilities were hardened against orbital bombardment, and the entire solar system was being turned into a fortress that could continue fighting even after the planet's surface was rendered uninhabitable. Dr. Angela Ross had spent 2 years working on the project that epitomized humanity's new approach to warfare. The solar defense grid was a network of weapon platforms, sensor arrays, and automated defense systems that turned every piece of debris in the solar system into a potential weapon. Asteroids carried concealed missile batteries. Derelict satellites had been converted into guided bombs. And even the abandoned space stations from humanity's early expansion had been turned into fortress platforms. The entire system is designed to be unpredictable, she explained to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Every piece of space junk can potentially be a threat. Every seemingly harmless object might be a weapon in disguise. The enemy will spend so much time and effort identifying and neutralizing false targets that they won't be able to focus their attacks effectively. As the third year of preparation began, human scout ships reported increased Zephyrian military activity along the border regions. Fleet movements suggested that Imperial Command was finally taking the mysterious reconnaissance mission seriously and preparing some kind of response. Admiral Patricia Vega received the intelligence reports aboard her flagship, Constellation, and knew that the waiting was almost over. The enemy was coming, probably in force, and humanity would finally discover whether 2 years of desperate preparation had been enough. How many ships can they bring against us? She asked her intelligence officer. Conservative estimates suggest they could assemble a force of 300 to 500 vessels, came the reply. But if they commit significant resources, they could potentially deploy over 1,000 ships. Vega studied the tactical displays that showed Earth's defenses and felt a familiar mixture of pride and terror. Humanity had accomplished something remarkable in transforming itself from a peaceful civilization into a military force designed for total war. But they were still facing an enemy with overwhelming technological and numerical advantages. Send word to all fleet commanders, she ordered. Final preparations begin now. We've had 2 years to get ready for this fight, and we're not going to get any more time. Throughout human space, the last ships of the recall were arriving at Earth with their precious cargo of people, equipment, and knowledge. The transformation was complete. Humanity had become something the galaxy had never seen before, a species that treated war as a form of art and viewed their own survival as a problem that could be solved through sufficient application of violence and creativity. Zephyrian Empire was about to discover that destroying one human ship had been the worst mistake in their 2,000-year history. The grand fleet of the Zephyrian Empire emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, like a constellation of death that had decided to visit an insignificant yellow star. 500 warships arranged themselves in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their shields at maximum power, ready to complete the extermination that had begun with the destruction of one small research vessel. Admiral Kethfor stood on the command bridge of his flagship Eternal Judgment and studied the sensor readings that showed the human home system spread before him. What he saw defied every expectation that 2 years of intelligence reports had created. The system appeared almost defenseless, with only scattered ships moving between the planets and minimal energy signatures from what should have been heavily fortified defensive positions. Analysis confirms the intelligence estimates were incorrect. His tactical officer reported, "We detect approximately 200 vessels in the system, mostly concentrated near the third planet. No significant defensive installations. No orbital fortresses. The enemy appears to have made no serious preparation for our arrival." Kethfor frowned as he studied the tactical display. The mysterious species that had been conducting reconnaissance missions throughout Imperial space for 2 years had somehow failed to prepare adequate defenses for their home system. It seemed impossible that any intelligent species could be so tactically incompetent. "Begin the cleansing operation," he ordered. "Standard formation advance. Destroy all military assets first, then proceed with planetary bombardment." The grand fleet began its approach toward Earth with the measured precision that had served the Empire for 2 millennia. Each ship maintained its assigned position. Weapon systems cycled through predetermined target acquisition sequences, and tactical computers calculated the most efficient methods for eliminating human resistance. Director Morrison watched the enemy approach from the command center beneath Geneva and felt a mixture of fear and satisfaction as humanity's greatest gamble began to unfold. The past 2 years had been spent preparing for this moment, when the Zephyrian Empire would finally learn that destroying the Endeavor had been the worst mistake in their history. All stations report ready, Admiral Vega announced from her position. Aboard the Constellation, Solar Defense Grid is active and standing by. All fleet units are in position. Morrison nodded and opened the communication channel that connected him to every human military unit in the solar system. This is Director Morrison to all Earth Defense Forces. Today, we discover whether 2 years of preparation have been enough. Remember what they did to Captain Shun and her crew. Remember that we tried to talk first. Make them pay for every meter of space. The first phase of the battle began when the Grand Fleet reached the asteroid belt and discovered that humanity had been busy during their years of preparation. What appeared to be routine space debris suddenly activated as thousands of concealed weapon platforms emerged from asteroids, abandoned mining stations, and camouflaged installations that had been invisible to long-range sensors. Captain Rodriguez guided her destroyer Defiance through the opening moments of the engagement and watched her tactical display fill with target indicators as the asteroid field erupted into violence. Mining charges that had been converted into guided missiles streaked toward enemy ships, while automated defense platforms opened fire with weapons that had been designed for industrial use, but proved surprisingly effective against military targets. All ships, attack pattern Omega, she broadcast to her squadron. Remember, we're not trying to win pretty. We're trying to make them bleed. The Zephyrian response was immediate and overwhelming. Plasma cannons that could crack planets began, systematically destroying the concealed weapon platforms, while shield generators that could deflect. Stellar radiation absorbed the desperate human attacks with contemptuous ease. But for every platform they destroyed, 3 more seemed to emerge from hiding places that their sensors had failed to detect. Admiral Kethver watched the tactical display with growing concern as his casualty reports began accumulating. The humans were fighting with equipment that should have been completely ineffective against Imperial technology, but they were employing it in ways that no rational species would consider acceptable. Ships rammed his vessels while broadcasting what appeared to be music. Fighters launched suicidal attacks that achieved minimal damage, but forced his formations to waste time and ammunition responding to threats that barely qualified as military assets. Admiral, the enemy appears to be using their civilian infrastructure as weapons, his tactical officer reported. We're detecting guided missiles that were obviously converted from cargo containers, mines that appear to be modified waste, disposal units, and attack craft that seem to be built from industrial equipment. How effective are these improvised weapons? Kethver asked. Individually, almost negligible. Collectively, they're forcing us to expend significant resources, destroying targets that should not require military attention, the Admiral studied the battle reports and began to understand what the humans were attempting. They could not match Imperial technology, so they were trying to overwhelm Imperial doctrine through sheer unpredictability. Every attack came from an unexpected direction. Every weapon was something that no military academy had trained officers to counter, and every tactical decision seemed designed to force his fleet to waste time and resources on threats that defied conventional analysis. As the Grand Fleet pushed deeper into the system, the human resistance became increasingly desperate and creative. Automated cargo ships filled with nuclear waste rammed Imperial dreadnoughts, while their crews escaped in pods that immediately began broadcasting surrender messages and emergency beacons. When the Zephyrian ships stopped to investigate the apparent casualties, the rescue pods exploded as proximity bombs. Dr. Angela Ross monitored the solar defense grid. From her control center on Luna, and watched her life's work unfold across the inner system. Every piece of space debris that had been converted into a weapon, every abandoned satellite that had been turned into a guided missile, every seemingly harmless object that concealed destructive potential was now revealing itself in a symphony of violence that followed no military doctrine ever written. Phase 2 activation in 30 seconds, she announced to the defense coordinators. All civilian craft begin evacuation procedures. Military units prepare for close engagement. The second phase began when the Earth Defense Fleet emerged from concealment behind the moon and launched an attack that redefined every assumption about acceptable military casualties. 300 human ships accelerated toward the Grand Fleet in formations that ignored every principle of tactical preservation, their weapons firing continuously and their reactors pushed beyond safe operational limits. Captain Maria Santos commanded the cruiser Vengeance as it led the desperate charge toward the center of the enemy formation. Her ship carried enough conventional firepower to damage an Imperial cruiser, but she also carried something that no military engineer had ever put on a warship: a manual override that would detonate her reactor and turn the entire vessel into a guided nuclear weapon. "All ships target the flagship," she broadcast to her squadron. "If we're going to die today, we're taking as many of them with us as possible." The human attack achieved something that no enemy of the Zephyrian Empire had accomplished in over 1,000 years. It broke their formation. Ships that had maintained perfect spacing for the entire approach suddenly found themselves forced to maneuver independently as human vessels appeared to be deliberately ramming anything within range. Admiral Kethver watched in horror as 3 of his heavy cruisers disappeared in nuclear fireballs when human ships detonated their own reactors during ramming attacks. The tactical computers that had been designed to calculate optimal responses to rational military behavior began generating error messages as they tried to process an enemy that treated suicide attacks as standard operating procedure. "Admiral, we're receiving what appears to be a communication from the enemy flagship," his communications officer reported. "Put it through," Kethver ordered. The voice that came through the speakers belonged to Admiral Patricia Vega, and it carried the cold certainty of someone who had already accepted death as an acceptable price for victory. "This is Admiral Vega of the Earth Defense Fleet to the Zephyrian command vessel. You destroyed the research ship Endeavor and killed 200 civilians who were trying to study ancient ruins. You opened fire without warning on people who tried to communicate with you peacefully. Now you're going to learn what happens when you threaten the human species." The communication ended as the constellation accelerated toward the Imperial flagship with its weapons firing and its reactor readings climbing toward critical levels. Kethver ordered evasive maneuvers, but his massive dreadnought could not avoid the smaller ship that seemed determined to ram his vessel regardless of the consequences. The collision sent shockwaves through both fleets as the Constellation's reactor detonated against the Eternal Judgment's shields. The Imperial flagship survived, but its defensive systems were overloaded, and 3 of its main weapon batteries were destroyed in the asteroid. In the high explosion dot as the battle raged throughout the inner system, the human strategy became clear to every Zephyrian commander who survived long enough to understand it. The humans were not trying to win a conventional military victory. They were trying to inflict casualties at a rate that would make the cost of conquering their system higher than the value of completing the conquest. Every human ship that died took enemy vessels with it. Every defensive position that was destroyed first transmitted targeting data that allowed other positions to inflict maximum damage. Every civilian evacuation ship that was attacked revealed itself to be a disguised missile platform that had been waiting for close-range targets. Admiral Kethvar realized that his grand fleet was facing an enemy that viewed their own ships as ammunition in a war, where victory was measured by how much damage they could inflict before being destroyed. The humans had spent 2 years learning everything about Imperial tactics and technology, then designed a military doctrine specifically intended to exploit the Empire's dependence on overwhelming technological superiority. Admiral, casualty. Reports indicate we've lost over 60 vessels, with significant damage to twice that number, his tactical officer reported. The enemy has lost approximately 80% of their fleet, but their remaining ships are continuing to attack. Kethver studied the tactical display and made the hardest decision of his military career. The Grand Fleet could probably complete its mission and destroy the human home world, but the cost would be the loss of nearly half his ships to an enemy that should have been eliminated without significant casualties. Signal the fleet, he ordered. Begin withdrawal to hyperspace. Prepare a full report for Imperial Command. As the battered remains of the Grand Fleet retreated from the Sol system, Director Morrison stood in the ruins of the command center and surveyed the cost of humanities. Victory. Earth's orbital infrastructure was in ruins. The defense fleet had been virtually destroyed, and millions of civilians had died during the battle. But humanity had survived, and the Zephyrian Empire had learned that some species fought wars differently than others. The message that Admiral Kethver would carry back to Imperial space was simple and terrifying. The humans could not be conquered at any price. The Empire was willing to pay. The species that had destroyed one research vessel had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization that had transformed war into an art form and treated their own survival as a problem that could be solved through sufficient application of violence and creativity. The real war was just beginning.